Hello YouTube, another live stream here. I wanted to do another episode of Geography in Baseball, and one moment. I figured I would make this one a live stream, and I'm actually going to feature one of my old videos that I made about baseball on my channel, The Geo Scholar, and as you can see in the title, it is Go West Baseball. I remember a quote being put out there, and it was, "Go west, young man, and grow with the country." I really thought about that, and I thought about how baseball, well, not just baseball, I thought about how much the country has grown and how many people have pushed westward. In fact, I'm going to show you one of my videos. Like I said, my channel, I'm going to show you videos from my channel from way back. Look up Horace Greeley. You've never heard the quote, "Go west, young man, and grow with the country"? I think Horace Greeley paraphrased that quote. Go look up Horace Greeley. Got it. Stay tuned. I'm going to show you one of my old videos. Ooh, more people coming in. Awesome. Be prepared. I got a new I got to show you one of my videos. First, I got to scroll and find it. This is getting so boring. Ah, here it is. Put this on full screen. Yeah, I'm a Mariners fan. Been a Mariners fan most of my life. Not originally, but I did live in the Seattle area for a few years. I started kindergarten there. I'll start it again for those who missed it. I'm going to start this again for anybody who missed it. You see how most of the population is clustered in the Northeast, and as it starts to move a little further south and then starts to move progressively west. These are like the 15 largest cities for each decade, and the point of this is to show us a slowly westward progression of the population. Notice how some California cities are starting to pop up. Texas cities too. I showed you that video because if you look at the history of American population shifting, if you really look at it, you will see a trend. You start out on the Atlantic coast and then you progressively move further and further west. And as you go further west, you know, you think about it a lot of now. There have always been people out west, but you never had the large progression, like the large shift westward until later in America's history. And how this relates to baseball? Well, for for a sizable amount of time, Major League Baseball was confined, like studying about urban areas instead. It's a better indicator of population. Well, urban areas. What I did this for, how I gauged, I made the maps from scratch on Microsoft Paint, and I did it by population center within the city limits. I have to warn you guys, the video I show you, those are just about the top 15 largest cities, or the top 10, top 15. It is not like it's just a guide. But with baseball, I'm going to show you, I got my video about baseball and progression. I actually have. But, I showed you how the population slowly went west. Well, the same thing happened with baseball. You know, baseball is starting in the eastern US, but it progressively went west and south. That's progressive, that's what happened. And now I'm going to show you a video. Here it is. There's my video about baseball. That's another video. I wanted to show you this video. Now, I wanted to show you that video because, you noticed how baseball. Oh, you watch the video and you notice a lot of changes going on between 1953 and 2005. And I'll discuss them piece by piece. You start out in the You start out in the northeast corner of the United States. The bulk of the baseball world in 1903 to 1952 is New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis. I'll name the teams right off the bat. The Boston Braves, the Boston Red Sox. Teams barely come down south. Actually, we got teams down south now, but anybody who's watching, go out and share this video. I'd like more people to get a geographic perspective on baseball because, spring training starts on Sunday, starts this coming week. I figured now is as good a time as ever to start about this. But, you got the teams, the Boston Braves, the Boston Red Sox, New York Yankees, New York Giants, Brooklyn Dodgers, Philadelphia Athletics, Philadelphia Phillies, Washington Senators, Pittsburgh Pirates, Cleveland Indians, Detroit Tigers, the Chicago Cubs, the Chicago White Sox, the St. Louis Cardinals, St. Louis Browns. I gotta count that again. Yeah. Braves of Boston, Red Sox of Boston. And then we go to New York. Boston. Boston has always been a big city, one of the bigger cities in the U.S. But back then it was like, Boston was like one of the first, You got, the Cincinnati Reds. Yeah, Cincinnati too. You got the Boston Red Sox, Boston Braves. Boston used to have two baseball teams. The New York Yankees, the New York Giants, the Brooklyn Dodgers. New York City used to have three. And at one point it only had one. But that was only for about 4 seasons. I'll get into that later. The Philadelphia used to have two baseball teams. Used to be the Phillies and the Athletics, and now it's just the Phillies. You got the Washington Senators, you got the Pittsburgh Pirates, you got the Cincinnati Reds, the Cleveland Indians, the Detroit Tigers, Chicago Cubs, and Chicago White Sox. Chicago still has its two baseball teams. St. Louis used to have two baseball teams back when the city of St. Louis was much, much bigger and much more crowded. But St. Louis used to have two baseball teams. I'm going to get into all of this in a moment. 1, 2, 3. Now, we're going to start with Boston. We're going to start with the first move, which occurred in 1953. Baseball in Boston it's had a tortured history. The Boston Red Sox won a few World Series, but it also went 86 years without winning a World Championship. The Boston Braves only won one, and it only had 2 pennants. And in 1948, the last time the Boston Braves would play in the World Series before leaving the city of Boston, the Cleveland Indians beat them. And for Cleveland, that would be the last time to date that they would win a World Series. For the Boston Braves, within 5 seasons, they would be gone from Boston. They would leave for Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the thing about it was like Boston in the 50s. A lot of major cities reached their peak in population back in the 1950s. And a lot more cities are starting to suburbanize. Boston being no exception. Boston metropolitan area starting to see more growth in the suburban areas. And I think the one big thing was like you're having two baseball teams in one town, but this for the city of Boston, it was like there was only room for one. There was only room for one baseball team now. And for the Red Sox, it was like, the Red Sox having the Red Sox had Ted Williams. And he was quite popular. So it was like, baseball was starting to really come back to Boston, but the Boston Red Sox were like considered the darlings of the baseball world in Boston. And the Boston Braves they endured sort of your second class status, and it was like they didn't want to be in a city where, you had to compete with another team and that other, everybody else wanted to see that team. So there was a geographic move. Go west. They went west. They went all the way to Wisconsin. They went all the way to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and became the Milwaukee Braves. And that was the first move. 1954. I'm going to give you the name of that current team now. The Baltimore Orioles. Out of any shift, this is actually a shift. This shift stands out because the Baltimore Orioles obviously are very far east, and they originate from a team that was very far west of the Mississippi River. At one time in history, there were two teams that played west of the Mississippi River, and both of them were in St. Louis. One of those teams were the St. Louis Browns. The St. Louis Browns were basically, how would I put it, the poverty trap of baseball. They were the poverty trap of baseball, and yeah, they were just like, actually, they endured an existence far worse than the Red Sox. Because at least the Boston Braves would win a little more. But the St. Louis Browns really didn't win much. They only went to one World Series ever in their entire history in St. Louis. Meanwhile, the St. Louis Cardinals are a very respected franchise in that city. Now, one thing I wanted to mention. The city of St. Louis hit its peak of population back in 1950 with a population of around 850,000 people. St. Louis used to have that many people. And this is what ended up in, this is when St. Louis's population started to go down. And, now the city of St. Louis has about 315,000 people. That city's population has dropped so much, it is scary. It has quickly become one of the fastest emptying cities in America. Granted, the city of St. Louis, its borders are basically fixed. Yes, that is a big drop. Big drop. Yeah. Big drop. But the city of St. Louis's borders are fixed, which means it can't grow anywhere. It can't annex anything. So the city of St. Louis could never really, it had, population-wise, when it dropped, it couldn't annex anything. But with St. Louis, it was like, I think in one big way, one theory I may have to consider, it's, you're in a city where it's like not enough room. You think it's crowded. You've got a very crowded city, and there's probably really nowhere to build another stadium that easily. At least then. Very difficult. And especially for a team that really isn't doing that good. And it's like, the thought process as well. We could probably help the Cardinals out, but we're not going to help this team out. And so it's like the St. Louis Browns are finding themselves unable to compete in a city that, they're, in St. Louis, they're the poverty trap, and the Cardinals are the team everybody wants to watch and play for. And so the St. Louis Browns go east to Baltimore, which doesn't have a team. Ironically enough, that is the hometown of Babe Ruth. Ironic. The team that Babe Ruth, who for a certain period of time was considered the center of the baseball world, Baltimore didn't have a Major League Baseball team. Fans in Baltimore looked to Washington, D.C., to the Washington Senators. And the Baltimore Orioles, well, the rest is history. The Baltimore Orioles would win more world championships within 17 seasons in Baltimore than the St. Louis Browns ever did in 50 years. Oh yeah, population. You see, when I mentioned about St. Louis, you're starting to see peak in population, but then when you're starting to see shifts in population, you see shifts in baseball. And I'm about to get into that soon. Philadelphia is next. Philadelphia. You got the Philadelphia Athletics and the Philadelphia Phillies. The Philadelphia Athletics have been sort of an up and down team. They certainly had more success in Philadelphia than the Phillies did. The Phillies did not win their first world championship until 1980. Yeah, they had to wait nearly a century. Oh yeah, they go way west. That's going to be a two-part. Just stay tuned. That'll be a two-part. You notice this. Many of the cities that I mentioned, the cities that had teams. Hold up, I gotta check something. Many of these cities that are having teams back in the day, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Boston, New York, etc., they're all located in one part of the nation. But it's like baseball is progressively moving west. You would think between the Phillies and the Athletics, you would think the Phillies would move. You see, here's the thing. By the time the 1950s came, the Philadelphia Athletics were a shell of themselves. And the Philadelphia Phillies were coming off their whiz kid days. Jim Constanti, Robin Roberts, the days after they jettisoned Ben Chapman, who was the manager of the Phillies, who basically treated Jackie Robinson like crap whenever they had to face Jackie Robinson because, well, that's a whole other story right there. But, the Phillies and the Athletics are in the same city, they're in this, it's crowded and, it's like, and the Phillies end up moving to, the Philadelphia Athletics end up moving to Kansas City in 55. They become the Kansas City Athletics. This is the first move so far away from them. This is like, they're not only moving west, they're moving west of St. Louis. This is the first move where they move. Oh, Periscope. I'm putting this on silent for now. This is the first move so far west of the Mississippi, it's crazy. See, at this point, teams weren't moving west of the Mississippi. The Philadelphia Athletics did. And I'll get back to that. We'll hear a part 2. Now it gets interesting. We shift from Philadelphia to New York. But let's go back to the Kansas City. You see, baseball had always been a mainstay in the Midwest, but this was the first time it had gone so far west to Kansas City. Major League Baseball is going to Kansas City. This is the first time that this was ever happening. And you think about how historically the U.S. population had moved west. Now you're starting to see baseball move west. You're starting to see that population, because as populations have moved west, baseball followed that pattern. And then you look at the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. They're having a lot of problems. They're having a lot of frustrations that are going on. And it's getting to a point where it's like, how do we secure new facilities? Well, new facilities were provided west. This time it would be coast to coast. This would be the first time that Major League Baseball would make its introduction into California, here we come, right back where we started from. Yes, they would go to California. The New York Giants would become the San Francisco Giants, and Brooklyn Dodgers would become the Los Angeles Dodgers. You see, there had been a move west all the way to California in the first place. San Francisco, Los Angeles, people were going west for years, but now baseball catches up there because the San Francisco area, the Los Angeles area, these are growing cities in the West. And baseball is now going out there, tapping into a growing population out there, where it's not too hot, not too cold. Now, San Francisco, I'll get into the climate stuff later. I have a video about that on my YouTube channel about San Francisco was kind of chilly at Candlestick Park. But it wasn't the worst. It wasn't the coldest it could be. Because you had colder places you could play. But, you're moving westward. You're moving to a relatively milder climate. You're moving to a sunnier climate. You're going west. You're going to a growing population. You're going to a growing fan base. You're tapping into a population boom. People are going west. There are 30 MLB teams. I'm about to get into the Canada story pretty soon. Sit tight. I'm getting into it. It's like you're coming out of New York City. This, one of the older cities in the eastern United States. Bigger, more crowded. And then you move west. You move in, there's relatively more space, it's growing. You move from east to west, coast to coast, Atlantic to Pacific. And that's what happened in 1958. San Francisco and Los Angeles got baseball teams. I'm going to check my battery power. Now, New York City would get another baseball team, the New York Mets, in 1962, and there they would remain. By the way, the New York Mets play on Long Island. How? Because Queens is part of Long Island. They play in Queens. Queens is part of Long Island. A lot of people will some people will disagree with me, but if you look at it geographically, Queens is part of Long Island. So, that's where the Mets play. They play in Queens. They would get, New York City would be a multi-team baseball. It would be a 2-team baseball town. You notice all the cities that I mentioned with that baseball left? None of those teams got a second team. Only one team remains. In Boston, the Red Sox remain. In Philadelphia, the Phillies remain. Yeah, they represent the southern boroughs on Long Island. They do. I'm just saying they play on Long Island. Because Queens is part of Long Island. But New York City got another team. Philadelphia didn't. Boston didn't. And I'm about to step into Washington, D.C. and make a trip out to California. Oh, yeah, true. I'm about to make another one. In 1961, in the early 1960s, the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim would start out as the Los Angeles Angels. And the Los Angeles Angels are the only homegrown. Well, not the only home. They're one of the 2 homegrown California teams, and the birthplace of suburban baseball, as they play in Anaheim, California, in Orange County. And with Orange County, California, you got your own growing population. You've got suburbanization, and more people are moving there because so many people are moving out to California. And you got a growing market, so it's like the greater Los Angeles area gets 2 teams. And Southern California is not done yet. You got the Washington Senators, which have endured a tortured existence in Washington, D.C. And Calvin Griffith's not too happy out there. The city of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities were growing up to 1950. They would experience some suburbanization, but the population has grown. And there's a market in the upper Midwest for baseball. And, people want it. With the Washington Senators are like, we're going to go up to Minneapolis. Actually, Anaheim and Minneapolis, St. Paul area. I lost my train of thought for a moment. The Washington Senators would move to Bloomington, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. They would move to a suburban area, so suburban baseball was, with the California Angels, a suburb was just given a franchise. Minneapolis, St. Paul area, Bloomington was given a team that transferred. So it's like, they're not an original, but the Washington Senators became the Minnesota Twins, reflecting the Twin Cities. And the Twins would eventually move into Minneapolis. But that, they're showing your population going west, going into the upper Midwest. One thing to consider, there had been a steady population flow into the upper Midwest for a few years, but the city of Minneapolis reached a population peak in the 50s. but Minnesota keeps growing. Check my battery power. But they would move. 1962. Baseball moves southwest. It moves south-southwest. This is the first time that Major League Baseball relocates. Oh yeah, Twin Cities area is big, big. Twin Cities area is big. But the city of Houston gets baseball. Houston, Texas. The first baseball team in Texas, which will be the first team to win the from Texas to win the World Series. And the first Texas team to go to a World Series. Houston, Texas. Houston, for baseball in Texas, Houston is a bunch of firsts. First baseball team to play indoors, thanks to a humid subtropical climate which induces a lot of afternoon thunderstorms. The first to play on artificial turf. And they pioneered those rainbow guts uniforms with the orange tequila sunrise on the torso part of the uniform. But one thing about, that's the first time baseball goes so far south into what was then Jim Crow country. You see, you have to understand, in the 60s, the South's trying to come out of Jim Crow, and I think with the city of Houston, they're thinking, if we want baseball, we're going to have to integrate. We're going to have to change. And I think for the city of Houston, getting baseball was kind of a way of like, well, we got to throw the shackles of Jim Crow off if we want baseball. And in many ways, when the baseball team was given to Houston, not moved to Houston, given to Houston, an expansion team in Houston, baseball was put there. They were first called the Colt 45s, named for the gun. And then, the gun that, quote, saved the West, because this is Texas. But then the team name was changed to the Astros to reflect, I think it was to reflect the NASA being there in Houston. Oh boy. It was to reflect the fact that NASA was having its facilities there. And then I'm going to have to speed this up. 1960s. In the 1960s, 1966, baseball, this is the first time baseball goes from north to south. The Milwaukee Braves are given, I think they were given some lucrative deals, and so I think they moved to Atlanta. And the Atlanta Braves have been here in the Atlanta area for 50 plus years. They moved from Milwaukee to Atlanta. Interesting that there is a population shift from the north to the south during the 60s and 70s and 80s, and now you're seeing a population boom in places like Charlotte, Atlanta, Nashville. You're seeing in Orlando, Dallas, Texas, and I'll get into Dallas, Texas later. 1969, things get interesting. California gets another baseball team, the Padres. 1969, Kansas City gets the Royals. Why? Because in 1968, the Kansas City Athletics left Kansas City after doing poorly there and moved to Oakland. California gets another baseball team. California would get 5 baseball teams within 12 years. combination of people moving west and baseball having a market there in California. And then Kansas City gets another team in 69. The Pacific Northwest market is being tapped. Yeah, Cali. The Pacific Northwest market gets tapped. The Milwaukee Brewers used to be the Seattle Pilots. But after going bankrupt, after having financial problems in Seattle, the Pilots relocate after 1 year to Milwaukee. They go east. This is another time a team has to go east. And after 4 years of no baseball in Wisconsin, baseball returns and they become the Milwaukee Brewers, reflecting the beer-making heritage of that city. 1967, the Expos got, not the Ex. In 1967, you had an exposition. It was like a World's Fair. The 1967 Exposition in Montreal. At the time, Montreal is the largest city in Canada. And that's who got a team, the Expos. The Montreal Expos were named for the 1967 Exposition to celebrate the centennial of Canada. So baseball moves north, moves west, moves east, moves west, it moves. In 1961, the Washington Senators moved to Minneapolis, St. Paul, Washington, D.C. Yeah, that happens. Yeah, the amalgamation of, municipalities. I gotta check my battery power. But yeah, the amalgamation of the metropolitan area. I'll explain that later. But with baseball in Washington, D.C. failing again, the Dallas-Fort Worth area is growing. And it's spreading, with Dallas on one side, Fort Worth on the other side, and, the growth from both is like merging into this big metroplex. In the middle, you have Arlington, Texas, suburb of Fort Worth. In 1972, the expansion team Washington Senators, not the original Washington Senators that would move to Minneapolis and become the Minnesota Twins, but the new Washington Senators, the new and not so improved Washington Senators, moved southwest. They moved southwest into the Dallas-Fort Worth area, representing a rapid population growth in the state of Texas. Tapping into that market, a market that was traditionally... Hello everybody, I'm back. I had problems with my battery. The connection pretty much went to pot. So I'm back again. I'm coming back to the live stream. I'm sure. But the thing about it, I was talking about the expansion of baseball into Texas and how, it represents the growth of the population. And I'm going to end the stream here. I'm going to do a part 2.